also, I think that's I when I read that, I completely sympathise, empathise with it because I'm an old man as well. Um, but it also seems to be something to do with, or it seems to link with some of the things that you were saying about the way early on England, this very increasingly weird, the more you talk about it, the more weird we become, place where going back to just patterns of marriage and kinship and all that sort of stuff, seems to me that women um, not having to marry, and it seems more and more okay not to be married now and to be still to be accepted as a full citizen in England, and putting aside the sexist stuff for a little while. But it seems as though what the models of a working woman throughout their lifetime, never getting married, never having to get hooked into being a child bearer, and that's that, but actually being fully part of society and everything that's going on, and being intellectual if they want to. That seems also to be something that the English have been doing for quite some time, in a way that, and again, it seems to be linked to this kind of modernity that we're talking about. The families within, the patterns within families and kinship and all that. So is that fair comment?
Yes, so as I was saying, contrasting European
Yeah.
countries, which said something like Italy is a hell for women, purgatory for uh, animals, and a hell for servants, or something like that. Or no, anyway, the contrast was England was a paradise for women,
Yeah.
a purgatory for servants, and a hell for horses, or whatever it was.
Right.
Um, it's difficult to talk about the subject because if you talk up the historical position of women, you are assumed to be some male chauvinist pig who's overlooking the terrible plight from which women have only just recently escaped.
Yeah.
But having studied medieval England and Anglo-Saxon England, and diaries and letters and law books and so on for the history of England, and you've taken me on to one of the main themes of my life, which is the study of English kinship and family patterns. And I've written a book on marriage and love in England, and so on and so on. And the origins of English individualism is about this. What is striking, it may not strike you if you're English, and it looks pretty bad as a woman, what it was like to be, a 17th century English woman. Try looking at anywhere else. Peasant women in most civilizations, in Korea and China, India, and so on, their position was pretty terrible. Not in all, and in parts of Africa and so on, women had a high status, and Amazonian women and so on, but generally, through the long period of civilization, women in most civilizations were enormously hard worked, and they had the double role of bringing up children and earning a lot of the wealth from farming. They were married off young, they had high mortality rates, they were looked down on, had an inferior status, they couldn't address a man in the same language, and so on. So the status of women, widespread over human history in the last 2,000 years, has been pretty awful. And against that background, what is striking about from Anglo-Saxon times through medieval to early modern England, and then modernity, is the very high position of women. Now, to just take one example in law, if you read Maitland's account of English law, you see that women, a woman as an infant, as a child, has the same legal rights and responsibilities and position as a male child. They inherit normally the same. If someone injures them in some way, in terms of property, a daughter who has property, it's safeguarded in the same way as a man. A woman is in no way, as a single individual in medieval law, inferior to a man. They can't be treated in any other way. They come before the courts as equal to men. And this is the English legal tradition. They are just as high up. And the same in religion. In the form of Christianity here, which is different from Catholicism, an English woman is not in no way inferior to an English man in the sight of God. So in religion and law, in economics, women are equal. Now the crunch comes with marriage, because marriage is like, well, it's like the US Senate now, which is divided 50-50. And if you get into trying to pass a $2 trillion, this is a topical reference, you have to have a casting vote. And the vice president has given it. Same with marriage. Now, you have the husband and the wife. So when you get married, until recently, well, it's ambiguous. The woman slightly lowers. That is to say, she becomes under the man in the sense that if they have a real dispute about property or children or whatever, the man has the casting vote. And, she can out reason him, she can leave, she can do what she likes. So it's pretty balanced. And if you look at English marriages, the marriages of my parents, my grandparents, and many English families, looking back on their parents, they see that it's the woman who runs the family and is more powerful than the man in many ways, and actually takes the decisions, even if she may look as if she is deferring and bowing to her husband. It's actually she who decides on the new car, and he goes out and decides on the model, etc. So basically, in marriage, and this is one, it's related to, as you mentioned, to the optional marriage system, because women knew perfectly well, and it was pointed out, their best state was not to get married. Once they got married, they lost some sovereignty. And in fact, the best of all states was to be a merry widow, because then you got the advantages of your husband's property. You were rich, but no one could boss you around. So don't remarry if you're a widow, just have a really good time. And if you look, if you want evidence for all this, have a look at literature. Have a look at Jane Austen, have a look at Shakespeare, have a look at Brontes and so on. And you will find that the relations between men and women are very, very nuanced and balanced. Shakespeare's women are very tough, many of them, and stand up perfectly well to the men. I mean, there's some based on models from other cultures and so on, Desdemona and so on, but basically, who is it that kills Macbeth? It's, or rather, who organizes it, the killing, Lady Macbeth. So basically, we have a Lady Macbeth civilization. And this, it's remarkable that we should have this.
Well, King Lear is a good one, isn't it? With the three
King Lear, yeah, the women and King Lear are the bosses of the show. And this is something that struck many foreigners who came. If you need further evidence, you look at travelers who came to England, and they say, England is run by women. If you look at our rulers, who have been the greatest rulers of England? Women.
Yeah,
Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria, and now Queen Elizabeth. They're the bosses. But you have to remember how extraordinary it is. And it's something which goes back, Tacitus talks about this in Germania and so on, that we have a funny kinship family system, and we certainly do. So the spread of the idea of the equality of women came from here, went to America, where the women are tough too, but it's against Roman law because the whole of Roman law, and therefore the whole of European civilization, is based on what's known as patria potestas, the father's power. The father, and the same of Chinese civilization, Confucianism, is based on the father dominates. Males dominate women. Women are by birth inferior. They have less religious ritual status. They have less social status. They don't own property in the same way. You can attack them. So in almost all civilizations, women are born almost slave-like. In England, a woman is born equal to a man, though in marriage for a time. And the last thing to say is that people see the development of the rights of women and the power of women as a kind of gradual, they were terrible in the medieval period and fairly bad in the early modern, and then they got back. Actually, it fluctuates because the position of medieval women and the women we studied in our 16th, 17th century villages was very high. I did a study of an ordinary English woman in an English village in the late 16th century and looked at her activities. And she participated in all sorts of law cases against very powerful men. And she was a very tough woman. And she was just an ordinary village woman. And at that time, the status of women was pretty high. It sank. It looks as if it sank in the later 18th century, changes in the marriage laws and the property laws. So women's status dropped in the early Industrial Revolution. And it was picked up again in the married women's property laws and other laws in the 1860s, 70s. So they regained a position they'd had earlier.
Why did